NIV 1984 edition today. And there's some very interesting directions there. In fact, we just sang one of them. And what happens is Peter starts out and he's going through these very important parts about God's power. And of course, he was with Christ in a very intimate way through much of the 3.5-year ministry. And he gives us some very specific instructions. He talks about how we should know that the prophets and the ancient people of old and even the angels wanted to know what we know today. So how do we apply that? Well, beginning in verse 23, he gives us very specific things to do. He says, interestingly, in verse 13, after we know that we have this information that the prophets desire to look into and that angels even desire to understand, that we are to prepare our minds for action. That's an interesting statement. The Greek actually says, gird up the loins of your mind, which is a battle position, and it means to be ready to do something about what you know. But then he goes through 5 things, which will form the basis of what I'm going to talk about here briefly. He tells us to prepare our minds for action. Then he tells us to be self-controlled. And then he goes on, he says that we are to set our hope fully on the grace which is before us, which means to visualize our eternal reward and keep it in front of us. And then he tells us to break old thought patterns and habits. He says, don't conform to the evil desires that you used to have. And then he sets the expected outcome, and he sets the bar high. Just as we sang a few minutes ago, he says, because the one who has called you, God himself, who has asked you to form a relationship with him and tapped you on your mental shoulder, he says, be you holy, and be holy in all that you do, in all your conduct. For it is written, be holy because I am holy. So that's a tall order. Our little company does a lot of what's called change management. People have inefficiencies and conflict, and they can't get on the same page with each other, publicly or privately, so they call us and they retain us. And what we find is a lot of the answers to the challenges that they face are based in what we just read. They have spiritual roots, they have spiritual solutions, even though they may have secular applications. So, as we enter the days beyond the days of unleavened bread, I submit to you that we're in a period now, or we will be at sunset tonight, in a period of application. So I would suggest that maybe we think about the possibility of we're now entering the days of unleavened thoughts. Some of you may remember a sermonette I gave some time ago, where I took the old, you boomers will recognize this, the old logo of Trans World Airlines, and held that up and said this might be a memory piece for you. Some of you may remember that from Lafayette. And what I was trying to illustrate here is you could use this as an acronym for thoughts, words, and actions. Because that's kind of what Peter is talking about with those 5 points. TWA, thoughts, words, and actions, speaks to the point that all sin, all good things, all behavior, all conduct that we do originates between our ears and our mind. TWA is what prepare your mind for action is all about. So we're back to that high bar. We're supposed to have holy conduct, which means to be set apart. And as we'll go through here in a few minutes, what we want to leave with is the old saying that what you are, what you eat, may be better thought of as what you think is what you are. So what you think between your ears and what you remember and do, and those thoughts, words, and actions. Thoughts originate, they lead to words, we speak them sometimes, but that's where we act. So how do we move forward? Well, there's a physical side to preparing for this, and in that physical side, I submit to you that we are up against the varsity, because to break these old thoughts and habits, there's another being, there's an adversary that doesn't want us to do that. We're told in Ephesians that there's an individual called the prince of the power of the air that influences us and changes our thoughts and puts a thought in our head and tries to keep it there and tries to keep us to nurture it. Well, when we do that, as we tell our clients, there's specific things that happen to your brain when you nurture certain kinds of thoughts. And there are several medical professionals today, so I'm not offering medical advice, and I invite you to to look this up for yourself. It's a very complex process, but there are some general themes when it comes to some of the things that happens in your head physically that is influenced by your spiritual condition in your mind. That's the production of a number of hormones and neurotransmitters. And I'll just briefly list them and ask you a few questions. Do you ever feel stressed out, like you're going to lose your mind, very anxious, very agitated? Well, if you do, you probably have an overabundance of a hormone that's called cortisol, Cortisol. If you have a lot of cortisol in your body, it's a reaction. It's what you allow, what you permit your mind to think about. When you start thinking about bad thoughts, about things that are going to happen, about what's going to go wrong tomorrow, what's going to go wrong this afternoon, what's going to happen, something that happened to you a long time ago that's bad. When you start harboring those thoughts, your body and your adrenal glands start producing cortisol. Cortisol is good from the perspective that it is a fight or flight syndrome, but when it's left unchecked and it's there all the time, it's bad for organizations collectively because overabundance of cortisol makes you stressed out, it makes you feel anxious, it makes you feel angry and resentful, and it's bad for people and organizations all the way around. So, on the other side are endorphins. If you like endorphins, you like good things because endorphins mask physical pain. They are produced by physical action. If you like to play basketball, or you like to take long walks, or you like to do something that's physical, if you like to hunt, or fish, or get out where there's physical activity, what you probably really like is endorphins, because they relieve stress and anxiety. As Stephen Colbert rightly notes, you can't laugh and be afraid at the same time. And the reason he says that is because laughter produces endorphins. So why do you think they have comedians on at 11 o'clock at night in a late night show? It's because that's how people relax and unwind, and it produces endorphins that allow them to sleep. Another big one is dopamine. These are very short. Dopamine is probably the most influential neurotransmitter. It comes from a tiny little gland behind your nose and your brain, and it's the pleasure center. It controls how you feel pleasure. Low lack of dopamine makes you feel bad, makes you feel unconfident. That leads, if you have critical, chronic problems with dopamine, it can lead to alcohol abuse, drug abuse, pornography abuse. So, because if you have lack of dopamine and you don't recognize it from a spiritual perspective, then literally what happens is that part of your brain can hijack. There's a whole study going on at IUPUI about this right now. It can hijack the higher cognitive centers of your brain, and you do addictive things that are very bad for you. So that's one to watch. Good dopamine comes again, there's another study that shows that people who go to church, when they like to be in that circle of safety around fellowship, their dopamine levels rise without any provocation whatsoever. So there's something there that's a little bit spiritual. Serotonin, as you all know, is called the leadership hormone. It makes you feel confident. Again, that's by physical. And the last one I'll talk about very briefly is oxytocin. Oxytocin. Oxytocin is the big one because oxytocin makes us feel like we can trust and that we can love and that we can have empathy in our brains. And guess what produces oxytocin? Many, many, many times I heard Tom Piney say, what the Church of God needs is more hugs. And he was right, and is right, because oxytocin is produced by physical contact. Somebody gives you a hug, somebody shakes your hand. You ever feel really stressed out and you're about ready to lose it? Your husband or your wife or your mom or your dad or somebody who you really trust comes up and puts his hand or her hand on your shoulder and you feel the stress drain away? That's the production of oxytocin. So, hugs produce oxytocin. The presence of oxytocin promotes friendship and trust. But here's the critical spiritual part. Oftentimes, you can train your mind to produce oxytocin by forcing yourself to think cognitively when you don't feel like it, when you fake it till you make it, when you just do it when you don't feel like it, and you try to make yourself believe and trust. You say, okay, I'm going to cognitively, intelligently do this. I'm going to put my trust in God. Even though every part of my brain is screaming, run for the hills, it's not going to happen. When you do that, your brain actually starts producing this oxytocin, and it has a long-lasting, not instant gratification effect that helps prepare your mind for action. So you can have a physical role in doing this. So, you ever hear the phrase, don't let bad people or bad thoughts live in your brain rent-free? That's related to the physical aspect that you can do and prepare for this. So, what are the keys to Peter's 5 directives? Which were prepare your minds for action, be self-controlled, visualize your future, break old thoughts, patterns, and change the standard of your daily conduct. Well, there are 2 quick verses, and I'll turn to one of them and we'll reference the other. The big one is 2 Corinthians 10, verse 5. That's 2 Corinthians 10 and verse 5. This is a real important one. 2 Corinthians 10 and verse 5 talks about how it says, we demolish arguments and every pretension or every opinion that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. I submit to you, we see a lot of that today. We see a lot of things trying to tear down the thoughts of God. We see a lot of opinions. We see a lot of people labeling what we call in our business a labeling strategy. People say sin is love. They say all kinds of crazy things. Those are pretensions. So we demolish those. But how do we do that? The latter part of the verse. We take captive every thought to make it obedient to Jesus Christ. Knows, I think, that's the lesson of the days of unleavened thoughts that we're just about to enter. That we take those things that we know and work on them. And to help do that, I prepared or updated a thing I handed out here a couple of years ago, which Mike Hensley and some others have, that if you'd like, it's a one-page spiritual inventory sheet. And you're welcome to take that and work through that yourself. It's got a whole bunch of, Don Turgeon will appreciate this, has check boxes on it. So you can check off what you have and what you don't have, what you might want to look at. And that may help you prepare your minds for action. So in conclusion, and this is what it looks like, thoughts on a 2016 spiritual inventory. So if you want it, it's going to be floating around here shortly. So thoughts, words, and actions. In Romans 12, verses 1 and 2. Okay, we don't need to turn to it. We know what it says. It says, present your bodies as living sacrifices. Prepare your minds for action. That means the physical as well as the spiritual. You can prepare, you can calm yourself through meditation. That's the hardest one for me. Prayer and fasting I get, meditation I don't. I don't do meditation well. Because to sit down and think and not do anything and let thoughts roll around in your head, that takes time. I always have an excuse, but it works when I do it. So thoughts, words, and actions. And then when you present your bodies as living sacrifices, which means you dedicate the time, then you can renew your mind through the Holy Spirit and know the will of God. So, thoughts, words, actions. Let's prepare our minds for action in the days coming ahead of unleavened thoughts.
Thank you for those words, Mr. Snyder.